The show Queen Charlotte, a Bridgerton story, was going around at the beginning of this year as something that was pretty popular. And me being a hopeless romantic myself with no man, decided that, of course, I was going to watch it. Not only did I watch it once, but I watched it twice because, well, that's just how it is. And I actually watch a lot of things twice, not just romantic stuff in my defense. But anyway, so one of the things that I liked about this show was not only the look at romance between people who you wouldn't expect, but also how it talked about or touched on mental illness and mental health struggles that people can experience, and specifically men's mental health, because a lot of shows and movies don't really talk about it that much. So, just to give a bit of a backstory, George and then Charlotte. George is the king of England, or he's currently ruling or about to be ruled, but he needs to get married in order to continue the family lineage. So the beginning of the movie shows the experience of Queen Charlotte and how she's kind of questioning, well, why does this person need to get somebody all the way, because she's living in Germany, so all the way from Germany to marry them. The wedding is put together, everything is nice, and then after that, they are supposed to be together. But what happens is that they don't live together. Immediately after they get married, she's sent to live in her own palace, and he's living in his own palace. And so when I first saw it, I was like, whoa, like this guy must be doing some type of underground like drug ring, or you just didn't know because it was so odd. So I forgot to mention that there are actually different accounts as to what George was experiencing, but the reason that he was isolating himself was because he was experiencing episodes of, the psychiatrist referred to it as psychosis. However, online, some reports say that it was mania, where he would have these intense energy that he would use to study astrology and different things. And it would also lead him to even do act in weird ways where he might like take off all his clothes and talk to the stars. So it's not necessarily super clear to me. I don't know about the full extent of his symptoms were, but that's the reason that he was isolating himself from her and kind of keeping her away from him. She's just kind of perplexed and shocked, and so was I, at the fact that she's being sent to live in this huge palace away from him by herself. But I'm going to talk about the main themes that I saw in the series about men's mental health. The first thing that I noticed is the idea that mental illness and successful leadership cannot be simultaneous. If the king is declared insane, he loses his throne. That's one of the lines that was used in the series that basically gives the idea that somebody cannot be a successful leader and have mental illness. It can't be simultaneous, it can't go together at all. And especially for a man in leadership, it doesn't work. That's one of the things that stuck out to me. And I was like, oh, that is a pure case of stigma. The best definition of stigma that I've seen recently is defined as a mark or a tribute that somebody has that causes them to reduce their status in society. And that's pretty much exactly what's happening here, where they're basically saying, you know, if he's declared insane, he can't rule as a king. And so recently I found out that there are actually two types of stigma. There's one that researchers identified as public stigma, which is when others kind of have stereotypes about mental illness and they push it onto people who have a known diagnosis or who have a mental illness. And then there's something called self stigma, which I didn't know was a thing. But apparently, it's when somebody basically endorses the stereotypes of a stigma and they accept it within themselves. So that was very interesting. This show, we can see that happening both ways, where internally you can see that George kind of feels that he's not fit to be able to rule because of this. And that's why he spends so much time in the gardens, because he wants to avoid having to marry somebody and he wants to avoid possibly being exposed with his episode. I don't know what exactly it was, but I'm just going to say psychosis. I often wondered if celebrities like Chris Brown or Kanye West, if they got their diagnosis of bipolar prior to being successful, I always wondered if they would still be seen as worthy, or if their music would have still been considered as worthy of listening to because of that diagnosis, or if they would have been declared as unfit to sing or unfit to be a performer. We'll never know because of the fact that they got the diagnosis later on. But I do find it very interesting because whether we want to admit it or not, a lot of these attitudes of success and mental illness not going together are still very much present today. In the show, George tried to express how he was uncomfortable with leading the country or taking the next steps to do that by getting married and continuing the lineage because of this mental illness and because of what he was experiencing. And every time he would indirectly express this, maybe by changing the subject to talking about his garden or talking about something that wasn't relevant or kind of fighting the fact that he doesn't really need to be married, he was indirectly expressing his emotional discomfort. And oftentimes, when he would do this, his mom would kind of come back at him with like the fact that, look, you need to leave the country. We can't wait around forever. People are waiting. And while I do understand that that was a different time and that's a whole different world of responsibility, I do think that her reaction speaks to the fact that men back then often didn't have a safe place to express their emotional discomfort or pain. And similarly, today they don't really have a safe space to express that either. And a lot of times, if they do, if that's expressed through to men or even to women, sometimes indirectly shut them down as well or brush it off. Another thing that the relationship between him and his mother showed me, at least, was that a lot of times men are fed messages about how the world perceives them before they're given the opportunity to develop how they want to perceive themselves. And this could kind of be seen in his relationship with him and his mother, when I believe he was talking to Charlotte and telling her about how he was often made to feel like the downfall of England or the downfall of his kingdom was on his shoulders, because he was fed messages like, if you don't eat your peas, then that can lead to the downfall of England, or if you don't do this right, then it could lead to a disaster. And that's a lot of pressure for a kid to face, and I imagine it could be somewhat traumatic. Also made me think about how a lot of times those same messages are still being taught to men and boys today, where something as simple as bringing somebody flowers on the first date could cause somebody to be perceived as a simp or a pushover, versus them being able to develop how they want to be perceived in the eyes of the other person. They might want to be perceived as somebody who is caring and thoughtful, but a lot of times they don't have the opportunity, or they're being fed messages from other people about how to be perceived. Another thing that I noticed is there's a trend in this show and in other shows that I've seen about men's mental health issues. There's a theme of men would rather stay silent or wear a mask rather than burden other people with the reality of their mental state. But when I say men would rather stay silent or wear a mask, it's not necessarily meaning that they want to do it on purpose, but they kind of default to that because of the fact that they don't really have anywhere to express their reality of their mental health struggle that they're going through. So a mask is basically another form of covering up something that you don't want somebody to see, or of putting on a performance, or just covering up something so it's not visible to other people, right? In the series, one way that he's kind of masking is through his actions. He does that by giving Charlotte a fancy house, giving her all these maids and servants. And another way that he did that as well is by giving her the Pomeranian dogs to compensate for his lack of spending time with her and his lack of presence with her. He's trying to kind of mask the fact that he's not there because of this episodes that he's experiencing, instead of actually like just talking to her about it. Staying silent in this series is shown through isolation. That he's isolating himself by not sharing the same house as her, not sharing the same bed, the same space. And on top of that, he's constantly spending time in this observatory where he's like studying the stars, the skies, etc. A study that was done that looked at why men isolate themselves with mental health issues or when experiencing mental health issues. And one of the things that was found was that men tended to isolate themselves from others in order to protect others from their low affect, suicidality, or to protect themselves from social rejection. The last two, suicidality and social rejection, wasn't really too surprising to me because I can see that as being a motivating factor to want to isolate yourself. But what surprised me was when they said protect others from a low affect. Low affect is basically just a fancy way of saying a sad mood or feeling down or just not feeling upbeat. And I think that kind of goes to show that the idea of men being protectors went so far to the fact that men isolated themselves because they felt that they had to protect others from their mental state and their sadness and their depression and their suicidality. There's a point in time where Charlotte finally asks him, like, why are you, what do you do in the garden, or what makes you want to spend your time there instead of spending time with me? And of course, if it's a hobby that he wants to do, then fine, but she started to really feel rejected. And instead of taking on a stance of anger, she decided to take on a stance of curiosity. And that's something that I feel like men don't always have the privilege of receiving. A lot of times they're met with anger for their mistakes from women instead of being met with curiosity as to why they might have done something a certain way. At first, he kind of gets defensive and she's like, no, I really want to know. And he shares that when he is in the garden, he actually feels like a man and a human, whereas all his life he's felt like an exhibit his whole life. And that really struck me because I never thought about how men could feel like an exhibit. But it goes to show that men can feel like objects too. The narrative is often told that women are objectified for their bodies sexually, and this can lead to a variety of different experiences. And I'm not even here to negate that because I've had some instances of that as well, and it's not fun. However, when he said that, it really brought to my mind about how often men might be seen as exhibits as well. We might look at men for their money, for what they do, for what they can bring to the table, for what they can provide for us, for their status, instead of being looked at for their character or what hobbies they do. Like in this case, George liked to do gardening. That was one of his strengths. But a lot of times if they show a flaw or if they're not as ahead in life as other men are, or if they have a mental illness, we might consider them to be less than or consider them to not be as successful or as important as those who might show otherwise. Imagine how some men must feel who are constantly being told that they should be powerful, or they should be successful, and that those who don't, or just feel like less of a man because maybe they didn't meet the mark. The last thing that really made me angry in this series, but it was really good, was the relationship between George and the psychiatrist. And within their relationship, there was this theme, and that's the idea that mental illness is triggered or is caused by a lack of resilience, a lack of perseverance, or a lack of not doing enough. And I kind of noticed it when the psychiatrist was saying that you're used to being giving everybody orders and you're used to comfort and splendor and basically having the finer things in life, but you're not used to obedience and you're not used to discomfort. And he was saying that because you're used to giving orders to like your maids and you're used to running the show, that's the origin of your psychosis. Therefore, the remedy to treat the psychosis in the psychiatrist's eyes was to give him the opposite, to give him discomfort, to give him experiences of torture and experiences that are uncomfortable and not pleasant. And he would often even refer to him as a boy and just be very like condescending towards him. And that completely, I literally felt my heart rate go up because it was triggering. And it just really made me angry because this is something that is very much prevalent today, that somebody's just not focusing hard enough, or if they're depressed, they're just not focusing on the good things in life enough. But it's also an idea that's put forth in Christianity or other religions where people are given the impression that obtaining favor through religious practices will prevent you from experiencing mental health challenges, or it'll reduce the frequency of your mental health challenges. And that's something that really frustrates me because not only is it false, but it also completely dismisses the fact that this person is not doing, or they're not trying to experience this on purpose. It sells the idea that the person has complete control over symptoms of mental illness, and sometimes people don't. We don't always know the causes. It can be environmental and it can be genetic. Of course, there are cases where maybe somebody can be putting in more effort as an individual to keep up with their mental health. Maintenance for somebody's mental health condition is not the same as telling them that they're having this mental health issue because of their lack of action or their lack of discipline. In this case, it was discipline. So thankfully, towards the end of the series, he's able to get away from the psychiatrist. They're able to discontinue their services or treatment. And he lives as he is, and he kind of lives with the psychosis. And his wife lives with him through that. One of the things that I did like about it is that it kind of presents, and I've seen this in a lot of other movies that look at mental illness, kind of something I noticed as well in Words on Bathroom Walls, where there's the idea that somebody who has a disorder or a mental illness shouldn't be making the decision for the other person whether or not they should be in their life based on that. Instead, they should leave it to the other person to decide. A lot of times people talk about mental health matters, that people online want to always talk about, oh, I go to therapy. It's easy to preach about it when you're not having to live with somebody who has a mental disorder or mental illness. And that's something that frustrates me because I've seen it where people might preach mental health this, mental health that, but when they're in situations where they have to share a space with somebody who has a mental health condition, their tolerance decreases or they become very impatient. And that's kind of how it ended, to where she was basically like, hey, I'm going to stay with you throughout this, what you're going through, because I love you. And that really made it kind of like a happy ending. It's not always a happy ending in a lot of people's reality, but it did give hope that there are people who are willing to be patient and to stick through somebody's side in sickness and in health, just as the vows say, despite the challenges that it might cause in a marriage or in a family. Was there anything that stood out to you in the series that you noticed about men's mental health as well, or while watching this? Comment below and let me know. Thanks for watching and stay amplified.